for those of you lucky people in Georgia, Ohio, Wyoming, North Carolina, anywhere else that's debating the original November topic, first off, I'm sorry. Second off, I don't want you to feel particularly left out, so this analysis is for you. I'm just not sure it can do as much as an analysis on a topic with two even balanced sides. So, the first thing is just the actual topic itself, which, as you all probably know already, is resolved. An Islamic cultural center should be built near ground zero. And before I actually look at the balance issues, the arguments that can come in, I just want to look at the actual wording. Because the very first word of the resolution is actually one that matters a lot. An Islamic cultural center. Not Cordoba House Initiative, not Park51, not any particular sponsor, not any particular imam. We're not talking about Faisal Abdul Rauf. We're not talking about the Kingdom Foundation. The question is just in the abstract, should one of these be built there? And that denies all kinds of arguments about the individual person, about the individual funding, etc. It's simply the idea of a center, which tilts it a little bit more towards the pro because they didn't have enough ground already. Anyhow, the second thing to look at for this, is probably going to be just the word should. And should is important because of how public forum is different from other kinds of aid. A lot of people are going to say, well, that means the burden is completely on pro. Pro has to prove because they're asked. They have to affirm the resolution. They have to show that it should be built. They need to show an affirmative reason that it has to be there and it can't be anywhere else. And I don't think that's true because that's really not what I see public forum as being. Public forum is different than the other kinds of debate in several ways. Pro is not the same thing as affirmative. Cross-X is not the same thing as crossfire. Con is not the same thing as negative. In other forms of debate, be they parliamentary, be they Lincoln Douglas, be they cross-examination policy, what you will see is one team that always speaks first and last and defends some kind of action. The other side speaks in the middle, only has to negate and defends the status quo. In public forum, either side can speak first. The status quo can belong to either side depending on the wording of the resolution, so those differences create one big difference, and that's the concept of presumption. In these other kinds of debates, you actually are in a situation where the con side, the negative side of those kinds of debates, doesn't have to prove anything. All they have to do is refute. They don't have a burden of proof, just a burden of refutation. So that means that all they need to do is show that there's no reason for it to be built, not necessarily a reason for it not to be built. They can win on just pure defense. I don't think that is true in public forum, particularly if the con team speaks first. The way I tend to look at topics myself is that the resolution becomes whichever side speaks first. Both sides have an equal burden of proof, and the con side needs to show why it should not be built. And I think it's pretty easy to do, because again, you don't have those three mechanics to actually implement the other necessities for presumption in those other styles. That makes public forum distinct, unique. The coin flip and crossfire are two parts of that, but just the actual speaking order and having either side being able to go first and a different side speaking last and speaking first makes a major difference in issues like presumption. So no, I don't think should means one particular side has a burden of proof. The other thing needs to show why it should not be, just not why it not should be, if you understand the distinction. Now, what that actually means for this is that con actually needs affirmative reasons. They can't just say, well, why does it have to be here? So if they do that, pro can still explain, well, here's a couple of reasons it should be. It should be here because they've said they're going to build it here and they've committed to it. It should be here because that's where an empty site is. It should be here because the mosque and the cultural center that's almost as close to the World Trade Center, just a couple blocks farther away, is overcrowded and full. They need a bigger building, so that's why it should be here. So, at that point, the ball is still back in Con's court, and they need a reason why it should not be. And part of the problem here is that Con has some very limiting arguments. There's really two options for a Con argument here. One is, it shouldn't be built here because Islam is equivalent to 9/11. Muslims and terrorists are equivalent. The other is, we don't believe that, but there are other people who believe that Islam is equivalent to 9/11 and that all Muslims have something to do with terrorism. And we need to respect those people's ignorance instead of changing it. And really, any con argument with one or two very minor exceptions is going to boil down to one of those two. And that becomes a big issue. Before I get into that, the last piece of wording is ground zero. In a lot of other kinds of debate, that particular choice of wording can probably be critiqued. for this form of debate, it is probably safe to assume that it simply means the site of the World Trade Center attacks. Whether that means just that block of city ground, whether that means the surrounding area, what near ground zero means, all of that is up for grabs. The trouble is, it's really difficult for the protein to actually draw a bright line here. Because where is near? Is 4 blocks away offensive but 5 blocks away okay? Is in Manhattan offensive but in Brooklyn okay? What are the other mosques that are already in Manhattan? What about the mosque that was in the World Trade Center before it fell? All of those are questions that make this debate, again, a little bit more one-sided, I think. So, let's talk about what can actually be done on con, because on pro, I think the debate is fairly straightforward. On con, there's a couple things that you can actually look at here. One of these things is just a question of what message are we actually sending versus what are the goals of this group. Because Park51 is supposed to be promoting understanding between Muslims and other religions, and that gets rather difficult if you show that they're going to have the opposite of the effect they want to have. If building it there is not in their interest and it creates more conflict than they avoid, then the burden will be on the pro-team to actually show why the conflict actually needs to happen, why this is an important site of resistance, and that is doable but difficult for teams compared to the other fairly easy, fairly intuitive pro-arguments. So aside from that, the other thing that you can talk about is just the idea of backlash, the idea that if you build it here, it will cause more harm than good. It will cause a backlash against Muslims, which will then cause Muslims to go ahead and backlash against the rest of America, and so on back and forth. It actually fuels the us versus them dialogue, which this was originally created to avoid. That said, whether running from controversy like this actually helps the dialogue or exacerbates the existing risks is certainly up for grabs, and certainly whether pro can respond to that. As far as the backlash argument, the trouble with that comes from the idea of intervening actors. If you have to show the backlash is a reason not to build a center versus a reason not to backlash, or why the backlash wouldn't happen somewhere else where there are mosques that have been defaced and bombed in other parts of the U.S. anyway. Many of these arguments against it are going to be arguments against building mosques in general. And no, it is technically not a mosque. It does have a prayer room in it. On the other hand, that doesn't actually make a difference for either side. The opponents of it don't care whether or not it's technically a mosque, and the proponents of it aren't going to gain any extra ground by showing that it isn't technically one. Just as there isn't technically a mosque in the Pentagon, there wasn't technically a mosque on the 34th floor of the World Trade Center. What you actually have instead are places where people go to pray, but do not have prayers 5 times a day, every day, with the resident imams. They're not technically mosques, but that is why the wording says Islamic Cultural Center. And again, whether that an Islamic Cultural Center would include a mosque or not is certainly not something that pro has to take a stance on, which again makes con have even more of a shifting target to have to try and strike out at. Aside from that, depending on your league or your judges, you may actually find the most effective path would be to argue against mosques in general, or to argue against Islam in general, and just take an us versus them mentality and explain to the judge that the clash of civilizations in America is under attack. If you want to do that, I'm sorry, I really cannot help you with that. That is something you would be doing on your own, and that I would not agree with, but I would understand why, if you were given a topic like this, it is not your fault, you would still want to win rounds and adapt to local sentiment. Again, though, do it on your own time. I'm afraid I can't help you with that. The only arguments I can see on con, if you're going to debate this conventionally, that are not intellectually bankrupt, and that are not going to rely on either your side's bigotry or saying we should honor other people's bigotry instead of going ahead and educating them, are the arguments about backlash, arguments about whether or not this actually achieves the goals of the people who are trying to build it. And again, that question becomes the goals of a larger movement rather than these particular people, because we're talking about a cultural center in the abstract, which robs con of some of the few remaining bits of ground that it might have had. Okay, so aside from that, I think that as far as deciding the coin flip, obviously the side is going to matter far, far, far more than the speaking order does. But at the same time, if you are con, you probably still want to go ahead and try to go second, just because con's defensive arguments are probably stronger than con's offensive arguments. You don't want to have to actually sit there and go on the attack for your entire first 4 minutes. You don't want to have just laybirds on the other team for the entire first 4 minutes. You would finally be able to find where they make mistakes, because everybody makes mistakes at some point, and go after those mistakes more, make the arguments who are right, their arguments are wrong, than actually looking at what's happening for you. And Khan can get away with that far more convincingly if they're going second, show that they're doing the better debating, even if they do not necessarily have the better side. That said, again, obviously side is more important. I'm almost tempted to say you're better off practicing your coin flips than you are actually looking up some evidence for this, because the evidence is actually kind of shaky when it comes down to a lot of the literature for either side. Many people arguing against this are arguing against this because the imam of the mosque has suspected terrorist connections, which is of course why he works in the State Department and the FBI at various points in the past couple of years. The other argument is the terrorist funding because of the Kingdom Foundation, which, aside from being the second largest stockholder in Fox News, has a Saudi Arabian at its head, which obviously means that it must be evil. So, I mean, I'm really not sure where their argument is coming from either. I think the backlash is a difficult argument to make. And it sounds good at first. It sounds like an issue of sensitivity. It's just a question of, should we respect 9/11 victims? Should we respect their families? Should we respect the survivors? But that's probably a difficult sell once you actually look into it. Once you realize that there were also Muslims who died in these World Trade Center attacks. And there also were people who were praying in, well, again, not exactly a mosque, but a prayer room in the World Trade Center when the towers fell. Muslims were victims too. Why should their voices be heard any less than the others, especially if they happen to be right? It is far easier to say in a debate topic, well, these people are wrong, they should actually take some time to actually look at who actually attacked them and why, than to say so in a political election. But even there, you've seen some people, specifically Cuomo and Bloomberg, actually come out in favor of that. Some of the evidence the team's going to try to use is polls just saying this is the will of the American people, they want this, they want that. The trouble is, the closer the polls actually get to Manhattan, the more they actually favor it being built. Not so much in rural New York State, more so in New York City, most of all in Manhattan. By the time you get to Manhattan, there's a pretty clear majority. But again, the question should be, does that matter? If these people's beliefs are wrong, then would that actually be a reason to honor them or to change them? If the point of this is to change people's beliefs, and at that point it just becomes a debate of solvency of, does holding out on this issue create a useful point of resistance to change beliefs, or does it make people much less likely to listen to anything else that is said by people working at Park 51? And I mean, they have already changed the name from the Cordoba House because Newt Gingrich and company claimed that it was a slap in the face referencing Muslim conquest in Spain. Personally, I'm a little skeptical of that, especially given that the alternative at the time was the lovely Spanish Inquisition, which when it took Cordoba back, did not exactly express the same religious tolerance that the Muslims did when they took Cordoba in the first place. But aside from that, it shows that they are willing to change things to help improve the image and to help reach their goals. The question is this an acceptable sacrifice for them? I think that is where Khan would actually need to make their stand in this debate. Last but not least, really just going to try and leave you with a little bit of food for thought, because a lot of people are going to make arguments about sacred ground, and a lot of people are going to make arguments about we need to respect what happened at 9/11. All of America was under attack, so on and so forth. And while this may not actually be a card in any debate round, while this may actually win or lose any round, it's just an interesting fact that might be worth knowing. When the World Trade Center fell down, when they dug the rubble, when they excavated it, underneath they found a mass grave. In this grave were 20,000, 21,000 slaves from back when New York was a slave trading city. Given slaves who passed through New York in the 1700s and early 1800s, it is a safe bet that between 6,000 and 7,000 of these slaves were Muslims. So technically, Ground Zero is a grave of far more Muslims than it is of 9/11 victims. And even if it weren't, there is overlap between the two. At that point, I'm really not sure where arguments of hallowed ground actually come into this, especially when there are all kinds of other, perhaps less savory business ventures and all kinds of other religious buildings in the area too that don't exactly hallow or consecrate the intervening 4 blocks.